Well, as I said, this week we started a new series, this series on Jonah. And I've been looking forward to this series. I really enjoy the prophets of the Old Testament. And Jonah, whether you know it or not, is considered a prophet. In fact, in our Bible, he often gets labeled as one of the, anyone know? The minor prophets. Never tell a Jewish person that they are minor prophets. That is very offensive. But there are these 12 prophets that fall into the Old Testament that we often refer to as minor prophets, or in Jewish culture they refer to as, anyone know? The 12. And the 12 are anything but minor in their minds. And in fact, as we see this morning, the 12 are anything but minor in Jesus' mind when he actually refers to them as well. The story has always been one that has intrigued me. Anybody else really like Jonah? I mean, the story. Has it intrigued you? So you're going to notice throughout the series, one of the things I'm hoping is that we have conversation on it. So we're going to drag some of you out of your comfort zone. We're going to talk. From my earliest days, I don't know why, I've always enjoyed stories of the sea and sea shanties. Do you guys know what those are? Like kind of songs about shipwrecks and finding islands. And so, you know, there's this Irish tune called the Irish Rover, which I love. It's about the ship that turns how many times around? Those of you who know it? Larry, I was expecting your help here. No? Turns 9 times around, and then the poor old dog drowned, and I'm the last of the Irish Rover, right? I love these songs and these stories that tell tales of the ocean. I was a kid that was raised on the Jacques Cousteau show and kind of recreated his experiences. When everyone else was playing G.I. Joe, I had these toys called Adventure People that were made by Fisher-Price, and they were ocean explorers, they were divers, and so I recreated Jacques Cousteau when everyone else was playing G.I. Joe or He-Man or something like that. Among my favorite seafaring tales were things like the Kraken, this monster, this Leviathan-like beast that was the giant squid and took down sailors. And I also enjoyed stories like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, this classic book of a novel that's going on to be a best-selling movie. Have you seen the movie or read the book, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea? Very few of you, I'm surprised. What about Moby Dick? That one, come on. You know, sometimes I get I'm told I use too modern of pop references. Moby Dick is from 1851. I know some of you even remember that year. No, I'm just teasing. It was a really good year. The prophets have also intrigued me ever since I was a kid. When I was 8, somebody asked me, "What's your favorite book of the Bible?" I said, "Jeremiah." Why? Because he gets to stick it to people, I said. I don't know why, but the prophets have always intrigued me. Might be some of my own prophetic nature that identifies with the prophets, with the weirdness that they are. Like, let's face it, the prophets are weird. Does anyone disagree with me on that? Like, Hosea has to marry a prostitute, kind of weird. Jonah runs away, right? Jeremiah at one point takes his clothes off, hides it under the rock, and weeps. There's some weird stuff in the prophets that we don't like to talk about. Jonah is a weird prophet. Prophetic types often are like round pegs trying to fit in square holes. But they often understand the heart of God in ways that others don't. So as we look at this prophet of Jonah, I'm hoping that we can grab just a piece of God's heart. So it's with a great excitement that I look forward to one of these stories that I think is one of the most memorable and unique stories in the Old Testament. I think it's one that will have a lot to say to us. And ironically, coming out of this series called Shift, I think it's also going to be one that's going to twist our paradigms a little bit. In 1851, as I said, Herman Melville, there's a name, he wrote a novel that went on to earn its reputation as the great American novel, and that novel was Moby Dick. It starts with one of the most recognizable lines. Does anyone know what the first line is? Go ahead. My name is Ishmael, or depending who translates, you can call me Ishmael. It's the famous opening line. It's this great literary work of this guy just introduces himself like that. And Ishmael, ironically, the name means God listens. So Moby Dick is really the story of Ishmael. He's this man who lives in Manhattan, and he's had enough of this city. It's too much. And so he leaves Manhattan in the middle of December, and he travels to New Bedford, Massachusetts. And it's there that he begins to figure out how he's going to get himself on a whaling ship. He has grown tired of humanity, and he's decided that he needs an adventure at the ocean to bring himself back to normalcy. Like Jonah, I think Ishmael is on the run from one tension to find himself only in another. Now, I don't know about you, but I often say you can call me Ishmael because the ocean is my place of peace. In fact, in the opening, Ishmael says this, and I deeply identify with it. Whenever I find myself growing grim around the mouth, whenever it's damp, drizzy November in my soul, whenever I find myself involuntary pausing before coffin warehouses, or we could say driving by cemeteries, and bringing up the rear of every funeral I meet, but especially whenever my hypos get such an upper hand of me that it requires a strong moral principle to prevent me from deliberately stepping into the street and methodically knocking people's hats off, then I count it's high time to get to the sea as soon as I can. Ishmael is this guy that's just had enough. He's ready to knock people's hats off. And he goes on to say, this is my substitute for the pistol and the ball. With a philosophical flourish, Cato throws himself upon his sword, and I quietly take to the ship. I love this idea that the ocean is this place where he finds this rest that he needs, this peace from God to control himself, to be at peace. He moves into New Bedford and he tries to find a place to stay, and he can't find any place. And back then, kind of pubs and inns were the same thing, and he walks into this small fishing one, and there the guy says, I'll rent you a room, but you're going to have to share a bed with this big pagan harpoon guy. And I mean, you better get used to it because that's just how it is on whaling ships. And I'm not going to say his name right, Ruth, sorry. Queequeg, okay? So he's this huge dude. Like, I imagine him in his story as about 8 feet tall, because he's got to be bigger than me for me to feel scared of him. And he's got like 300 pounds of muscle, and they describe him as just having these pagan markings tattooed across his body. And Queequeg and him become good friends, this Christian and this pagan sailor. And as they spend time together and as they eventually get on a whaling ship together, they begin to rub off on each other. And in defense of his pagan friend, at one point, Ishmael says one of my favorite lines. I say, and heaven have mercy on us all, Presbyterians and pagans alike, for we are all somehow dreadfully cracked in the head and sadly need mending. We are all cracked in the head and sadly need mending. Presbyterians and pagans alike. This is true of the holy prophets, that we're all cracked in the head, that the pagan sailors were all cracked in the head, of Christians in the church, and of a little town in which we are going to read about today called Nineveh. To me, Jonah and both Moby Dick are stories of mercy and surrender. And Jonah as a story not only inspires the story of Moby Dick, but the original story of Pinocchio and many other tales that we'll see throughout this. Before heading out to sea in Moby Dick, Ishmael entered a church service in New Bedford, Mass. It's a church that ironically has a ship, the front of a ship, the bow of a ship kind of standing out from the pulpit. And there's this old, aging New England pastor who's kind of broken with his English, and he takes to the pulpit and he begins to preach this colorful sermon to a service full of fish people, whalers, fishermen, people that live by the sea. And he stands up. Well, what's he preach on? What do you think he preaches on? What do you preach to whalers about? Jonah. He stands up and he gives, and I think it's chapter 4, and he pretty much just all of chapter 4 is just this long expository sermon on Jonah. He opens his sermons by saying this: shipmates. I like that. Shipmates, or priesthood, right? Like this idea that we're all in the same thing together. This book, containing only 4 chapters, or 4 yarns, is one of the smallest strands of the mighty cables of Scripture. Yet what depths of the soul does Jonah's deep sea line sound? What a pregnant lesson to us is the prophet. This morning, as we start this series, I hope that's what happens for us, that we find this passage pregnant with lesson for us. That we see the way that it intertwines as one of the deepest yarns. He goes on and he preaches on and on for a long time. I almost debated, should I just read his sermon as my sermon, and we could have called it a day. But he goes on to say this in a colorful way. But what is the lesson that the book of Jonah teaches? Shipmates, it is a 2-stranded lesson. A lesson to all of us as sinful men, and a lesson to me as a pilot of the living God. As sinful men, it is a lesson to us all because it's a story of the sin, the hard-heartedness, the suddenly awakened fears, the swift punishment, the repentance, the prayers, and finally the deliverance and the joy of Jonah. As with all sinners among men, this sin is the son of Amittai, who was in willful disobedience of the command of God. Never mind now what that command was or how it was conveyed, which he found a hard command. But all the things that God could have us do are hard for us to do. Remember that. And hence, he oftener, no one says that anymore, commends us, then endures us to persuade. And if we obey God, we must disobey ourselves. And it's in this disobeying ourselves wherein the hardness of obeying God consists. In Moby Dick, Ishmael watches his sermon in which he sees that we find this solid truth. And truth is found sometimes in the most unholy places as well, or in secular pieces of art. God's truth is embedded in our world, and it speaks to us if our eyes are open. Here, in a classical book, not religious in any nature, we find a great line about Jonah that could be a biblical commentary for all we know. We get this idea that following God is disobeying ourselves. We're going to see with Jonah is that was the one part he really wrestled with. It's a story that we are all cracked in the head, and we have to be aware of it and disobey ourselves. Ironically, Ishmael goes on, he boards a ship. It's a unique whaling crew full of pagans and Indians and just the most diverse group you can think of. And in many ways, it was a microcosm of the whole world. This morning, we look at the story of Jonah. One biblical commentary says the story of Jonah is best described as a microcosm of the world. So think about that as we pay attention to it. That it's this idea that we all have a lot to learn. John Wimber said the same point like this: it's important to be biblically literate, but we also must be biblically obedient. Jonah was what? What did he do for a living? Shout it out. He was a fisherman? No, Jonah was not a fisherman. What did he do? He's one of the 12. Jonah, prophet Jonah, the reluctant prophet. He was a prophet by trade. Do prophets have to be scripturally literate? Where he wrestled with was not knowing the scriptures. He would have known the scriptures. He would have probably had Psalms traveling with him. He was not obedient. So our series for this, the vision for our series is this. Our Jonah series is about taking 4 weeks to learn and I underline this, complete story of Jonah. To realize that God is more merciful than we are often comfortable with, and God desires more surrender than we are often willing to give. And I think the first chapter we're going to look at here in a minute is really a chapter on calling. And I think that calling, if I can just tangent here for a moment, is one of the most misunderstood and undermined aspects of the church. How many of you have remembered a sermon on calling? Ironically, in Tampa, we visited a church movement known as the Tampa Underground, 214 plus house churches, and they were built around two values: helping people discover that Jesus is Lord in every area of their life, and helping them to discover their calling, their personal calling. And if you were at members meeting last time, I referred to this like this, that I see church needing to be a hall of Tyrannus, this idea that when Paul was tired of traveling, he rented this place and just kind of trained people and then sent them out. And that in that we learn our personal calling. So many times when we talk about calling in church, we talk about the way we ordain calling in people, or the way that we send people overseas because of their calling. But when Jesus shows up, he blows up the paradigm, and every one of us is a missionary with a calling. Or as the prophetic word said this morning, each one of us is called to proclaim the truth of the kingdom with the aroma of Christ. When Katie and I were in the church planning training with the Vineyard, they nailed, I don't even know how to say it, this idea of calling into our mind. They said calling is the crutch that you fall back on when everything else hits the fan and falls apart. Calling is the crutch you fall back on. This idea that you've heard the whisper of God of who you are, what you were created to do, and that stays with you. Every once in a while, to remind myself of my calling, I sit down and I journal my calling. I do it about once a year. And I said to myself, when is it that I felt called into what I do? Personally, when did I personally? And then I journal, when did I first own that for myself? You know, when did God tell it to me? When did I own it for myself? And where did I see people confirm it in me? Derek and Josh will probably remember when I interviewed them, I asked them their questions. Where did you hear people affirm it in your life? Where did you first own it for yourself? Some of us don't know our callings. In fact, if I'd ask you today, what is your calling? Most of us, sadly, probably would not know how to answer it outside of our situational callings or our communal callings. This idea that, well, we're all called to be the church, or I'm called to be Christ in my family. But the idea of calling, as we'll see with Jonah, goes further than that. Quakers call this birthrights, or they call birth giftings. This idea that we are born with something that has created in us to be something unique. And for me, a lot of that times it plays in, we hear it from the Holy Spirit in discovering who we are in Ephesians 4, right? Apostles, prophets, shepherds, evangelists, teachers. Our calling is not always our job, but it is who God has called us to be. Like Judas. Yeah. Yeah, we can live our calling out in a matter of ways. Yeah, it's great. One of my favorite verses on calling is this, and write this down. I'm going to watch it. Write it down. You just write down Romans 11:29, because this is the key verse for this whole series. This whole series of Jonah, this is our lens. I was going to sit down, but I'm not used to sitting down. I wanted to make this conversationalist, but I like to stand. Romans 11:29. Out of the God's Word translation, it says it like this. God never changes his mind when he gives gifts or when he calls someone. Or you may know the NIV version that says this: God's gift and his call are irrevocable. They cannot be pulled back. They cannot be withdrawn. They cannot be deemed void. When you are called, when you know your calling, it doesn't matter. For instance, when I stood in my ordination papers, Lord, I probably shouldn't tell this story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. Keith was sitting with me, and we were in with the ordination team, and they said, what does it mean for you to have this paper that says you're ordained? And I said, it means a whole bunch more to you than it means to me. I said, there's no scriptural evidence for this thing. I mean, this is you stamping your approval on me, which I don't need, is what I told them. And then they said, well, what will change when we give you your ordination? I told them they could take that paper And then somebody asked what I meant by that, but I won't explain it. I don't care about it because I know who I'm called to be. I will be doing the same thing. When I became pastor, a lead pastor, and Keith said, is the stuff in the neighborhood going to stop? I can't stop that because that's my calling. It's who I am. What we've been called, what God has whispered in our ears cannot be separated from us. It cannot be withdrawn no matter who says otherwise. God never changes his mind when he gives gifts or when he calls on somebody. Hopefully through this series, the one thing you'll take away is this need for a calling on your life, that you'll spend time figuring out what is it that I was created to be, so that calling is your crutch to fall back on when it all hits the fan or everything falls apart. Now, what was the first thing that we think about? What's the first thing we associate with the story of Jonah? A whale, right? He gets eaten by a whale. Who said it? Twyla, right? It's the first thing we think of. Oh, Jonah's the whale that gets eaten. Jonah's the prophet that gets eaten by a whale or a giant fish or, maybe a dogfish. There's all these different rumors about it. Jonah is a little over 50 verses. Do you know how many of those apply to the whale? The number one thing we associate with Jonah takes up 4 verses of the story. So that means less than 8% of the story of Jonah is about a whale. And the thing we associate with him is whale. This misdirected lens of Jonah has gone on to not only affect our theology, but inspire other tales, like I said, with Pinocchio and Moby Dick. And it's important, I think, that we fix our lens on this, because I think the story of Jonah is much more robust than we've given it credit for. As I told my Sunday school, I was feeling fine in Tampa, by the way. It was 77 when I left. I had no cough, no sneeze. Came home and kissed my wife, and the rest is history. She walked out in Sunday school when I said that. I had to say it again just to see if you'd walk out. Secondly, what do we think about why did Jonah get swallowed by the whale? So, that's what we think of first. Why did he get swallowed by the whale? To preserve his life, because he was scared, right? Who's that, Jonathan? Right? He's fearful. What if that's not true? What if that's not true? That's how we tell the story. What if there were prophecies by the other minor prophets at the time that said Jonah knew, that said Nineveh would not repent, that its judgment was already made. And so what happens is Jonah's concerned. He's confused. I was just hanging out with Nahum, and he was like, no, that town's like dead, like God's already judged it. What are the other things that prophets have to do? They have to stay clean. They have to stay pure, right? Nineveh is not a clean city. It's far from a pure city. Prophet's calling is to stay pure. No way God said that, right? Because there's stickiness to sin. If I go there, there's going to be some crazy stuff that I'm going to see, and it might kind of step up with me. And what if he didn't feel fearful as much as he didn't want to believe in what God was doing? And I think sometimes that's what we're guilty of. I don't think Jonah wanted Nineveh to be saved. When you hear in a little bit about what Nineveh was like, what it did, what the Assyrian Empire did to the Jerusalem people, I don't think Jonah wanted to be part of a reconciliation of stuff like that. Talking about people being brought into town, tied up by their arms and their lips and their reproductive organs and drug apart till they popped off alive. And then they would make piles of bodies of half-dead people, mountains they called them, so that you would walk by. Yeah, Lord, I really don't want those people to be saved. No. And we then tend to see, because of our lens, Jonah as either fearful, or we call him the reluctant prophet because we think he was rebelling against God. But I think this is going to be a major shift as we look at this morning. he's not necessarily rebelling against God, but the call of God on his life. Most of us don't know our calling, and if we don't, we too may be acting in rebellion to the calling on our life. Jonah is a story where God is much more merciful and demands much more surrender than we're comfortable with. The other 92% of the story includes a storm at a sea, the conversions of sailors from another religion, a miraculous rescue, a song of praise, the repentance and reconciliation of Israel's archenemy, and an intensely honest dialogue between Yahweh and Israel's prophet. The conversation then goes on to reveal the nature of Yahweh, of God, to his people, to the Gentiles, to Israel's enemies, to non-human creations, even a wind, a fish, a vine, a worm, and a cattle. This book, in many ways, is a microcosm of God's relationship. One person says that this book is also the struggle of all the people who have come to terms with God's reputation. Jonah comes up against God's reputation in his story. And I would say that is where calling is found, when you are forced with Jonah, to face God's reputation. So we're going to read Jonah 1. We're going to look at it. We're going to stop every couple of verses and just talk about what's happening. Take quick 4 takeaways, and then we'll call the team back up. So Jonah 1, 1 through 17, it goes like this. The Lord spoke his word to Jonah, son of Amittai. Now, we don't know who that is, but obviously his dad was somebody who was known. He said, leave at once for the important city of Nineveh. Announce to the people that I no longer can overlook the wicked things that they've done. Jonah immediately tried to run away from the Lord by going to Tarshish. He went to Joppa and found a ship there going to Tarshish. Now, it's obvious one thing about this, that Jonah knows the voice of God. He's a prophet. He knew what the voice of the Lord was. In fact, he was a successful prophet. In 2 Kings, we say that he had delivered a message that proved fruitful. He's mentioned there as delivering a message that really delivered reconciliation. He knew the voice of God. However, whenever God calls us to uncomfortable tasks, it's easy for us to try to tell ourselves, that isn't a call of God, or that isn't something I'm made for, so I'm going to make myself, and I'm going to call it unavailable. Now, I'm going to make myself unavailable for it. And sometimes we do that in the church. I could serve there, and I'm probably gifted for that, but it's safer to serve over here. And so we have a bunch of people serving in positions that they don't have calls for because it's comfortable, or because the only way that we actually know how to honor call is in this like weird system that we have. Jonah probably convinced himself there's no way God be calling him to Nineveh. There were prophecies against them, and it was beyond evil. God would never have sent him there. I mean, he had already judged Nineveh, and Nineveh was impure. Their wicked things came up before him. Obviously, it's impure. It was the capital of Assyria. So in addition to popping limbs off, they were famous for skinning people alive. They were a town that was built around fishing, and they practiced that on people. They would pull off sensitive organs and body parts and parade them around on sticks, and the town would cheer. Sometimes they would build big battle signs, like they'd kind of re-depict their conquests on silver plaques that were around the town, and they have found them in archaeological digs. They would behead people and make mountains of them in the city. They would put spikes around the outside of their town and put heads on it so people would stay away. And the kings wrote in Assyrian literature, they were proud of their conquest. They were proud of being that violent. Most of us, if you don't know where Nineveh is now, maybe most of us do. Anyone have any ideas? Where would Nineveh be? It's a town in Iraq known as Mosul. Mosul is Nineveh. It's a town today that many of us as Christians would not want to be sent to. And ironically, Nineveh, we're not exactly sure what it means, but literally translated, it probably meant fish town. The town of the fish. They were a fishing town. They were near a port. Some have suggested it meant town of the fish. And historians believe, as all Assyrians pretty much did, that they worshipped gods that were half fish and half man, like Dagon. Not kind of like our superheroes today, Aquaman, right? Like, these things were like mermaid men. They were never women. I don't know why, but they were men, and they were mean. And Dagon was their god. He was a fish god. So let's just pause. What we know about Jonah is he gets eaten by a fish. He goes to a fish town to preach to people who worship a fish god. Now, calling is shaped by God so much, and you begin to see it already. God will always use our giftings and our personalities, but also our experiences in our calling. So already this story shows up. God's not absent. He's involved in his people. But Jonah shows up immediately and says, nope, I'm not doing that. Now, he's a prophet. He knows he can't run away from God. David has already happened. They've kept the Psalms before them. He knows Psalms 139. Where can I go from your presence? Right? And in that confession by David, he actually says, if I would land on another farthermore shore, I can't escape your presence. Jonah knows that. He's a prophet. He knows he cannot escape the presence of God. What he thinks he can do is make himself unavailable to the call of God. And prophets often do this. If we'd study all the Old Testament prophets, they've always, not me, Lord, right? Hey, Moses, go talk to Pharaoh. No, you want Aaron, right? All the prophets do this. Isaiah, but not me, or Jeremiah, wretched am I to have such a call, right? Like this is what prophets do. They wrestle with their call. So he pays for the trip, and I love that we needed that commentary, that he actually pulled money out of his pocket, that he made profiteering. Get it? Never mind. And pays for the trip. He wanted to go to Tarshish to get away from the Lord. The Lord sent a violent wind over the sea. The storm was so powerful that the ship was in danger of breaking up. The sailors were afraid, and they cried out to their gods for help. And then they began to throw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship's load. Now, I love the statement here, as I said, that Jonah had to pay for it. Because if he would have went God's way, God would have paid for the trip. If he would have went the way God was asking him to, he would have opened the door. John Wimber used to say, when God calls you to an extraordinary task, he will always provide extraordinary resources. But Jonah spends his money to get away, gets thrown overboard, and loses that money. Some have estimated that Tarshish was as much as 2,000 or 2,500 miles away from where God was actually calling Jonah to go. In his mind, it was as far away as he could get. Now, the funny thing about this is that Jonah knew he couldn't get away from God, right? That he could have stayed in his hometown and disobeyed God. I mean, we all do it. Every time we sin, we're in our hometown disobeying God. Jonah could have done that. What he was running from was the call. He was going to make himself unavailable. If I'm 2,500 miles away, God's going to have to send another prophet. Sorry, Nahum, right? Like, I'm over there. They knocked my microphone off. And why did he do that? Why did he have to run away? Well, in addition to making himself unavailable, he also leads this symbolic representation of Jesus' ministry. In fact, when Jesus is talking about how wicked the age is that he's in, he says, you ask for a sign, and the only sign I'm going to give to you is the sign of Jonah. And he says, this generation is so wicked that someday Nineveh will stand up at your judgment and judge you, because they at least repented when their sign was sent to them. And just as Jonah spent 3 days in the belly of the whale, I will spend 3 days in the belly of the earth, so and so. So automatically, this prophet that we view as rebellious and running away from God gets lifted up in messianic ways by Jesus. That's not the lens we've read the story of Jonah with. Secondly, I think this had to happen so God could use him. This part of the crew is so Moby Dick-like, right? He gets on this part of the story, like on with this crew, and they start crying out, whoa, Dagon, Dagon, save me, jump up. And I don't know what a whale god does. And push me to shore. Jonah is tired because running away from God is hard work. Laziness sometimes is a spiritual manifestation of actually not stepping into your calling. Jonah goes into the bottom of the boat. Whew, he ain't going to find me down here. Right? What else does this image give us? What comes to mind when we hear this? How many people started thinking of the New Testament story already where Jesus is asleep, right? Oh, doesn't he care about us? I mean, oh my word, we're going to die. And they start to throw their things over, right? Same story here. And we already see that this text is a forerunner to Jesus. And the way that the New Testament scatters, that it shows the disciples scattering. Now, Jonah had gone below deck and was lying there asleep, and the captain of the ship went to him and asked, "How can you sleep?" That's what the disciples asked Jesus, right? "Get up and pray to your God. Maybe he will notice us, and maybe we won't die." And then the sailors said to each other, "Let's throw dice," or if you have the King James NIV, "let's pick sticks," to find out who's responsible for bringing this disaster on us. This captain realizes this thing's going down. It's time to disturb the paying customer. He isn't really interested in going down with the ship if he doesn't have to. Not knowing that Jonah's a prophet, just that he's this guy on the run from God, he tells him to reach out to the heavens and call on his God, and maybe he will save them. Now, when's the last time that it started to thunderstorm that you were automatically seeing it as a punishment of God? Probably not. But in this world, the natural world was so connected with the spiritual world that everything had reason. Obviously, the storm is so bad. Somebody did something. We need to figure out who it was. So what we're going to do is we're going to gamble to figure out who it was. Right? That thing some of you guys should not be doing on a football game later is how they decided who's at fault. And do you know what I love about this? Let's throw dice to find out who's responsible. So they threw dice, and the dice indicated that Jonah was responsible. God used gambling to make his point. Truth is found wherever it is, even in the most implore places, because the truth of God, God's instruments and tools, will use whatever it takes to get calling into the lives of his people. Most of us would never step inside the foot of a gambling or even practice it, but here it's an instrument used by God. The captain of the ship went to him and asked, "How can you..." So they threw the dice. The dice indicated Jonah was responsible. I don't know how that is. Hey, you're the sixth passenger. We got six. I don't know how it works. What do you do for a living? Where do you come from? What country are you from? What nationality are you? Because that determines a whole other thing. Now, Jonah, a prophet, he can't escape his calling. Listen to his answer. "I'm a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of heaven. He's the God who made the sea and the land." Jonah could not escape who he was, even in trying to make himself unavailable from God. At this point, Jonah begins to realize one thing. I'm not getting out of this. I can't escape this. God never changes his mind when he gives gifts or when he calls someone. Say that with me. God never changes his mind when he gives gifts or when he calls someone. And the men were terrified. They knew he was running away from the Lord because he had told them. And they asked Jonah, "Why have you done this?" In other words, why have you done this to us? I mean, dude, couldn't you have took that other ship? The storm was getting worse, so they asked Jonah, "What should we do with you to calm the sea?" I mean, I thought that part was obvious. "Throw me overboard," he says, "and then the sea will become calm. I know that I'm responsible for this violent storm." Now, ironically, Jews hate the ocean. They view the ocean as all things unholy. It's where Leviathan lives. It's where the evil is. It's connected. It connects all of the evil cities. And so he's saying, throw me to hell. Throw me into a place where I cannot be reconciled. Throw me to death. Kill me. I deserve to die. I've stepped outside of my calling. If you want to save yourselves, the only thing you got to do is throw me. So I don't know what you would do if you were on the ship, but this is what the men decided to do. They said instead the men tried to row harder to shore. Hey, you know what? That's a dumb idea, dude. You're going to die. Like, don't know your God, but we're not doing that. And so they try to row harder. Now, in this time, when there were storms, they tried to stay out in the storms rather than going to shore. Anybody know why? What do the shores look like? They're all rocky and shoals. You were signing your death if you tried to go to shore in a storm. You know what, Jonah? We're not going to throw you overboard. We're all going to die with you. I mean, let's try to make this thing back. We got like a 1% chance of survival, but it's better than us being responsible. This kind of morality already sits in here that there's a sacredness to life, right? It's not something recognized in many of our states today, right? There's this sanctity of life that needs to be withheld. And he shows up with that in these pagan people here. And he says, storm, they couldn't do it. The storm's still getting worse. So they cried out to Yahweh. They cried out to God. They cried out to Jonah's God. Please, Lord, don't let us die for taking this man's life. Please don't hold us responsible for the death of an innocent man, because you, Lord, do whatever you want. Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the sea became calm. Even in this place, he could not escape his call. There, his call reeked on him. His aroma was on him in such a way that it caused pagan sailors on the ship with him to recognize that there was one true God who does whatever he wants. The men were terrified of the Lord. They offered sacrifices and made vows to the Lord. The Lord sent a big fish to swallow Jonah. Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Folks, God never changes his mind when he gives gifts or when he calls someone. There are 4 notes that I want us to take away this morning. You'll find them on the back side of your bulletin. I encourage you just to flip that over, and we're going to journal them just briefly. And I encourage you to think about them this week. Every week, at the end of whatever passage we look at, I invite you to spend time this week in that passage. For you, I invite you to look at Jonah 1 this week. First thing that we recognize is, first of all, the thing that should be here above all else is that God is involved in his people. And that's not your first point on your thing, but think about it. Sometimes we're functioning deists. Like, we believe that there's a God. We believe that sometimes he interacts with mankind, but for the most part, we go it alone. We're just doing our own thing. But the story of Jonah is showing that God not only gives everyone a personal calling, that he will make things happen using even the natural world to make sure it happens. That God is intimately involved in the world. Think about it. He's going to use lots of different things in this story to make his points. But our first point that we're taking away is this. We recognize that each one of us has a general calling and a personal calling. Our general calling is that fact that we are called to be the church. We are called in Matthew 28 to go make disciples. We are called to love God and love our neighbors. We have this communal or this general calling that all of us have. That what I told you earlier, each one of us are missionaries or disciple makers. That is our general calling. But then there's also a personal calling. Jonah's general calling was that he was a prophet. He was called to proclaim, to evangelize the world, to go and say what was on God's heart. And his personal calling was that God was telling him to use his giftings where? In Nineveh, in this violent, uprooting town. Jonah just couldn't accept that and wanted to make himself unavailable. Callings are unpredictable and they're uncomfortable. They require trust and his provision. If comfortable was the definition of callings, God would never need to call out, because we are creatures of comfort. We're creatures of comfort. It's too hot here. It's too cold here. Let's find that equal bit, right? Like, this bed is too soft. This one is too hard. Our lives are ruled by comfort. We live in a comfortable country with comfortable rules and with comfortable means, and we don't like to be uprooted from that comfort. In fact, we pursue even more comfort. Like, if I would just have X amount more in my bank account, if I had another car or some nicer clothes, then I would be even more set or comfortable in life. When Jesus is talking to Peter about building the church, he says, Peter, it's on this rock that I am going to build, and we translate the word church. But what he actually says there is my community of the called. It's right there, that rock called Hades, that I'm going to build my community of the called, or the called out. Calling is being called out of comfort into trust of God's provision. The calling of God, as we see in this story, is shaped by our giftings, our personalities, our skills, and our experiences. It's discovered in prayer. It's confirmed by others. It's mostly heard through the whisperings of God. Jonah, I need you to go to Nineveh, where wickedness has come up before me. I can't let it continue in my sight. Nope. Get in a whale, get in a boat, get thrown in, a big fish eats him, right? And there's a lot of theories. Like, we as a church love to explain how this is scientifically possible. It's not scientifically possible. Sorry, Ken Ham. It is not, so much so that they try to say it could have been this like dogfish that's extinct, and he had asthma, and so he would have to swim to the top of the water and gasp air so that Jonah could stay afloat. A dude in a whale is impossible. A dude in any fish is impossible. We must be okay to hold that kind of impossibleness in our faith. We have no problem. We wrestle with this. Like, is this symbolic? Is this not? Do you know that the Noah story shows up in other texts at the time? Babylonian text had a guy named Gilgamesh who almost had the exact same story. There's another story that almost mirrors the Exodus. And so we could make better arguments that those stories are mythical than this one. This one is unique to the Hebrew gospel, and it's echoed almost verbatim in the Quran. This story stands out alone. It is unique. The calling of God will always use experiences, and it took a guy named Jonah, who ironically his name means peace. What's the Messiah going to bring? Peace, right? Peace on earth. Today, a child is born. It took this guy whose name means peace, or dove, to get eaten by a fish, to speak to a fish town about why their fish god is stupid. God wants to use your experiences in his calling. And usually, let me just tell you this, the places of our deepest pain is the place of our deepest calling. That place that we don't like to talk about is actually where God wants us to discover authority to help others in. That wasn't even planned. No, that was good. You should be tweeting that. We can try to ignore or make ourselves unavailable to the calling of God, but it's irrevocable. You can ignore it all you want. You can ignore when somebody says to you, I think you'd make a really good preacher. Right? When someone said that to me, I was fresh back in the church. I gave him the middle finger. He wasn't going to put me on that stage. Right? I've knocked on some of your doors in here too. Now I'm going to burn up the heat a little bit and said, hey, you'd make a really good preacher. I'm not going to look at it once and no one's knowing who I'm talking about. Can't ignore callings that are on your life when God tells you, when others tell you, and when the calling of God is irrevocable. We can try to ignore or make ourselves unavailable. That's what we do. Sorry, I'm not doing this. Guess what? I got a job. I work a 9 to 5. Guess what? It's not greater than the call of God on your life. Next, the more we step away, I can't wait to Tuesday morning in the office. The more we step away, there's going to be some emails, I know. The more we step away from our calling, the more it chokes life from us and those around us. The more we step away from calling, the more it chokes life from us and from those around us. Dude, what did you do to bring this on us? Why are you here on our boat? Who is the victim in this story? Those dudes on the boat that are sailing with Jonah, right? Did they do anything wrong? But now they're suffering because of what? Jonah's making himself unavailable to the calling of God. What if some of, not all of our depressions, our anxieties, our issues in life are because we're ignoring the calling on our life and they plague us because we haven't stepped into who God wants us. We haven't allowed Jesus is Lord in that area of our life, that we've ignored. And you know what happens when we ignore calling? Then all of a sudden those people around us begin to get upset too. It's what came true of me when I moved back from California. And the only job I could get was Yankee Candle. It's one guy working with a bunch of girls selling candles. I know really good at how to cut a wick. I'm going to tell you that right now. When you burn those candles, you better have that thing at 1/8 of an inch, or it's going to create that little smoke thing. You ever wonder why your candles get that little black thing? All right, tangent, sorry. I was miserable. Our car died at $7.50 an hour. I didn't have enough money to make our car repaired, so I decided to start riding bike to work. I lived in Mountville, taking care of my aging and beginning to pass grandmother, riding bike to the mall to care for my family by working at a candle store over the holidays. I was miserable. I'm pretty sure if you asked my family, I made them miserable too. Because when we are ignoring our calling and we're not able to step into it, it has effects on others. Think about that for a minute as the team comes forward. I have 3 questions that I'm just going to leave you with. And I invite you just to stand for a minute. And I know we're over time. It's the introduction. The next ones will be easy and short. But we had to set the stage this morning for a new series. And for this series, I think there's 3 questions we need to know. We need to answer. I'm going to invite the team just to play lightly in the background. And I'm going to read these questions to you slow. Do you know your calling? Either generally or specific. You need to know them both, but do you know one of the others? Have you neglected your calling? Are you making yourself unavailable to God this morning? Some area? Or what is your Nineveh? What is God asking you to go to? But you said no. God says go, you say no. But trust me, as one pastor I know says, God's going to eventually go, oh, He's going to bring something into your life that's going to cause the fallout. You can shut yourself down. You can make yourself unavailable, your emotions, your heart, your mind. You can consume experiences in church that energize you. You can go to another church that feels more energizing. But at the end of the day, that's not going to solve what's happening in you. You can get another job. It's not going to feel any different. Calling is the crutch that you will fall back on, no matter what hits the fan.